many common people claimed, and many even farmers who maybe didn't own enough land or were too far removed from state capitals, which were 100 miles away in some cases, like Pennsylvania, made the claim, we need to be empowered more. We need to have more protections to ensure that we are more equal. Many of them made that claim. Now, what led political elites to start to listen to them? What led people like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, and eventually even Federalists, like John Adams and others, to start to say, maybe those people have a point? Well, what are you going to do? Let's say you're somebody who's looking at George Washington or John Adams' administration and you're saying they've got it all wrong. How are you going to try to get them out of power?
Rebel.
What's that?
Rebel.
Well, you could rebel, right? You could just sort of pick up arms, and a whole bunch of whiskey farmers in Pennsylvania tried to do just that. And you know what most American politicians thought of those whiskey rebels? Man, see, this is why democracy is a bad idea. Right? If you don't want to rebel, how are you going to try to get the people whose policies you don't believe out of power? You're going to try to change people's mind, right? You're going to write in the newspapers, this policy is a really bad policy. Absolutely, good. But what if the people who you tell, who vote, then re-elect the same guy? Then what are you going to do? You're going to what? I'm sorry? You're going to maybe run somebody else? Yeah, that could happen.
Move out west.
You could, yeah, that's right. You could just say, forget it. I hate these bums. I'm going to move out west. I'm coming to Ohio. Right? You could do that. Or you can move to Canada. Okay, you're gonna try to promote a politician of higher status. But what if the voters still don't like the candidate? You find different voters, right? You say, maybe this set of voters, I'm oversimplifying here, but maybe this set of voters just doesn't get it. But if we broaden the number of people who can vote, if we turn to people who previously weren't able to vote, who may be frustrated with the politicians who didn't let them vote, then maybe we can remove these guys from office. And in greatly oversimplified terms, this is what Thomas Jefferson envisioned. When he looked at John Adams, especially, and even George Washington, and he said, these guys don't get it. I get it, Jefferson of course assumed. I just need to make sure that people like me who seem to get it, right, have the ability to get elected to office. Jefferson, like most of his day, did not want to think of himself as a leader of a political party. He wanted to think of himself, and he wanted to think of the American people as having a generally common understanding of what the nation needed. And as a result, when he wanted to get elected, or when supporters wanted him to get elected, they said, who does Jefferson represent? He represents the voice of the people. And they sought within states to empower people who previously had not been able to vote to be able to vote. By the 1820s, largely as a result of policies led by Jeffersonians, property requirements in most states were dropped or significantly lowered. And those people who could participate in government, who previously could not, were now allowed to, right? This is a more democratic understanding. And after Jefferson's election in 1800, an election, just to complicate things a little bit further, Jefferson wouldn't have been elected had it not been for the fact that slave states were empowered by the 3/5 clause to send extra electors. Right? Showing again how democracy and slavery kind of coexist in American political history up through the Civil War. But Jefferson selling himself, or those supporters selling him at least, as a man of the people who represented the true American interests, manages to win election in 1800, and democracy starts to lose some of the negative connotation that it previously had. One of the ways that Jefferson supporters helped him get elected is they said, you know what's wrong with this John Adams guy? He's too elitist. He was all too comfortable when he was a diplomat over in Europe, over at parlors, sort of drinking tonic and hanging out with the French, schmoozing with the British. John Adams, I don't know whether he really is a true Republican. He may have some monarchical tendencies. Jefferson, on the other hand, he's a man of the people, right? Who owns this plantation and works on it. Of course, really, it's the slaves who work on it. But this idea that was really put forward in newspapers and elsewhere from Jefferson supporters tended to promote the idea that Jefferson represented more what common everyday Americans believed than did John Adams. At the same time that this was happening within American churches, increasingly more democratic understandings of the world were perpetuating themselves. Oftentimes today, I think we tend to think of churches and religion in general as in somehow being anti-democratic. Right? It keeps people from doing what they want to do. It sets all these sort of rules up that you have to follow. In many cases, it has this hierarchy. Well, in American churches, in the late 18th and early 19th century, that was not how churches perceived themselves. In fact, because churches provided a separate standard, God's standard, right, for good policy and for morality, many believed it served as an independent marker of how politicians should vote. Especially amongst Protestant denominations, new Protestant denominations, or relatively new ones, like the Baptists and the Methodists, who stress less hierarchy within the church, right? Who stress that really everybody should have a direct line to talking and thinking and discussing God. Within these churches, the belief that everybody was equal in the eyes of God promoted more democratic values. It also promoted great frustration when many of the churches that had existed since the colonial period, like the Anglican and the Episcopal, the Anglican and then later the Episcopal Church, as well as the Congregational and Presbyterian churches, in many localities, taxes, even after the Constitution, taxes went to these churches in order to help support and sustain their ministers. Right? There remained an established state church in Massachusetts into the 1830s. Right? Well, Baptists and Methodists and others said, this is not fair. We're paying taxes to support a church that we're not members of. And as a result, they began to claim, drawing on the language of democracy, right? Equality, representation for us. They began to claim that they, in fact, needed to overturn these state establishment clauses. And they successfully did so, allying themselves with Jefferson, right, who himself was no particularly devout Christian.